My name is Jazmine Benjamin. I am a PhD candidate here at the University of Birmingham in Alabama, not the UK. I'm really excited to be here today. My work is focused on the effects of circadian disruption on risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And I'm also a graduate student, of course, so learning about how to write a successful funding application is really important to me right now at this point in my career, especially moving forward into a postdoctoral position in the next year. I'd like to welcome our panelists as well and give them a couple opportunities to introduce themselves. We have three fantastic panelists this morning. Morning for me, afternoon for you all in Britain, I suppose. So I will pass it on to our panelists. Whoever wants to introduce themselves first is perfectly fine. Just please introduce yourself and your work and your experience with the topic of writing a successful funding application.
Maybe I can start.
Sure.
So hi, my name is Patricia Maciel, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Medicine at the University of Minho. This is in a city in the north of Portugal called Braga. So I teach biochemistry and I teach genetics, and I also am a researcher at the Associated Institute, basically in neurogenetics. So I lead a team of approximately, it varies a little bit, between 20, 25 people. And so I've graduated in 1998. My PhD was in 1998, and a short time after I started my own group. And I have, even though I'm in Portugal, and Portugal is not, let's say, very rich in terms of research funding, we're not, so it's kind of limited in that way. But I've always been lucky to be able to find funding in different, actually not only national, but also international funding. Small, big grants, a combination of things. And so that's my experience that I hopefully I can share today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dr. Bafor, Dr. Martin, whoever would like to go next.
Okay, I'll go, if that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Enitome Bafor. I'm a reproductive scientist. And I've had a very interesting career journey, as you'll see from my profile that was posted by Hello Bio. So I'm just going to say right now, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the National Cancer Institute at the NIH in Maryland. And I'm working mainly on autoimmune reproductive failure, or rather reproductive failure in the context of autoimmunity and cancer. And it's been a very interesting journey so far. Of course, to get here, I've had to write lots and lots of grants, and I'll be happy to chat with people afterwards about my failures. Like Matt said, I was actually very, very, I align, a lot with what Matt said, which is, discussing your failures, to get ideas about, being successful later on. So great to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Martin.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Bronwen Martin. First of all, thanks, Jazmine, for chairing the panel. That's great that you're doing that. I work at the University of Antwerp. I help our researchers with writing grants and writing their papers. I also do the science communication. So I have extensive knowledge with writing grants, both my own, because before this, I used to work at the National Institutes of Health in Baltimore, Maryland, in the US, where I was investigating aging, metabolic function and aging. And then here in Belgium, I've grown more accustomed with the grant process in Europe, which does have some slight differences with the US. So I sort of have experience of both now. And I look forward to joining you on this panel and discussing what it takes to write a good grant proposal.
Fantastic. Thank you. It seems like we have an international panel here, so we'll be able to get a lot of different inputs on all the different funding mechanisms that exist, whether it's in the United States or across the pond as well. We have a couple of pre-populated questions, so I'd like to make sure that each of the three of our panelists gets a chance to kind of weigh in on each of the questions. But in the meantime, if you all in the audience have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, and we'll be sure to mark off some time so that we can get questions answered as well. So for our first question, and then you all can answer in whatever order you'd like, but in your experience, what makes the difference between a successful and unsuccessful funding application?
Okay, I'll start. So to be honest, that is a very it's a much more complicated response than it seems, right? So in my experience, at least. So, but I'm just gonna share like the general from my experience, what I think makes the difference, because I've been, should I say, fortunate or unfortunate to be on all spheres of grant writing. So from applying, writing and applying for a grant and getting rejected, and also being successful for a grant, as well as being on the section where I review, I'm a reviewer for grant applications. So I've been in all spectrums, and it's in all parts of the spectrum. It's very interesting. So what I would say first of all is, one of the things that would differentiate a successful and a non-successful application is that successful application shows enthusiasm, there's passion, jumping out from whatever the application is about, and also being able to convince your reviewer that what you're going for, what you're applying for, is necessary. So you're putting everything you've got to make sure you're able to convince the reviewer, who may not be in your field, so that I think, stands out. So it's like an ad, when you think of an ad that, should I say, compels you to buy a product, for instance, that's kind of how it is, so that successful grant has been able to convince whoever the reviewers are that your application deserves to be funded, whatever spheres they're looking at it from. So it could be something for international projects. It could be something for conferences, attending conferences, however little or small. You want to be able to convince whoever is reading it that this is necessary and should be supported and funded. So to me, that's one of the many things that I think defines a successful application from a non-successful one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I submitted a grant last year in September. That was the first thing I was told, is to write it as if you're trying to sell your project as a product to the review committee. I think that's a really good way to think about it. Dr. Maciel, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yes. So I agree with these concepts. Also, I think it's important to define your idea, your research question, and in a very clear manner and focused manner. So that's, I think, one of the problems that I sometimes find in grants that I'm evaluating, this going in multiple directions. So I think being focused and clear is quite important. I think innovation, the feeling of novelty that your work is bringing, either in terms of the concept or the methodological approach, how you are addressing the question. So people like to see that something is, moving forward, really forward in a fast way with your project. And I think then there's several points that are important that show your expertise on the theme, and that there's on the theme and on the implementation, let's say, of your idea. So, for instance, to have, of course, the research team, the experience that you have, but even things like the well done budget show that you are, aware of what you are going to be doing. Good contingency planning. So you predict that there may be problems with this and this and that, because if you are very, all positive, it also shows that you're not aware of what is really the reality. And of course, I think it's, for me, two things that help a lot, and in my experience have helped a lot, is to have preliminary data, of course, when you are able to get, other source of funding to prepare to have previous findings. And a good visual abstract, a good scheme visually, in the sense of this selling of the idea. For me, a good scheme can save a project, in my perspective. And actually, it helps you also think about it. because when you are preparing the scheme, you are organizing your ideas. So in both ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, those schemes are incredibly useful, even when you're talking about publications. Someone who sometimes isn't in the field, it's good to be able to look at kind of a picture and be able to visually conceptualize how a project's coming together. And I can imagine that would also be extremely useful for a review committee for a publication or a funding application as well. Dr. Martin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with all these suggestions. I think that they're excellent. I agree with clearly defining the problem that you're wanting to tackle in your grant and then offering a potential solution. Often when I read grants from other researchers, I first have to read through 1 or 2 pages of just like general background information before I actually see what it is that they're trying to do in the grant. And I think really at the beginning of your grant, you just need to have a couple of sentences where you very clearly define, this is the problem that we're trying to solve, and this is how we go about doing it. Another thing that is important as well, and that often grant funding committees will look at, although it depends a little bit on the type of grant, is they will look at the expertise of the PI, of the person that is applying for funding. So keep that in mind, and really, as you progress through your career, try and build up as much expertise and knowledge. If you're an undergraduate, try and do internships, because if you've done a couple of summer internships, for example, and then you're applying for a PhD fellowship to do a PhD, those summer internships could help you to get the PhD fellowship. So also think about sort of your career progression and how you can sell your own skills and your own knowledge as a PI, besides just what is also in the grant. I agree sort of having some preliminary data if you're able to do that. Having mitigation strategies, so being honest and saying these are some of the things that could go wrong, but don't worry, we've thought about that and this is how we would overcome that. And be realistic as well. I think one mistake that people often make is that they are too ambitious and that they try to do too much. And then you will see the reviewers say, but they're trying to do too much. So it's best to really sort of define a couple of very specific goals and to really sort of try and accomplish those goals and not promise the world. So be very, very specific in what you say you can do. Yeah, that's what I would add to these suggestions.
Yeah, Dr. Bafor, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. Just to add to all the brilliant suggestions as well, is clarity. I think we need to, you need to be really clear and avoid making vague, sweeping statements. And the reviewer wants to know that you've thought through, every process, everything you're putting in. Because some of them actually know. Some of them know, when you write some methodologies and everything that you've done, or some of your potential pitfalls or expected outcomes, and they're like, this isn't, quite right. So some of them do actually know, because some of them are in the field and they know. So make sure to think through. So be clear about what you want to write. Avoid vague statements and be granular as much as possible. Of course, relevant details, not try to also put in, what's relevant, and make sure to have thought through it all. I think that's what some reviewers also want to see, that you've really given time and thought to what you want to do as well. So that easily comes across when you're reading grant proposals.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Maciel.
Maybe just one additional idea, that is to try to fit your proposal to what is the call. So read very well what's the call for application. So what's the scope of the funding agency? What's their mission? What do they want? And that, I think, can make a lot of difference to adapt, because there's different things that you want to do, but you adapt your proposal to that funding body, which is has a plan, a goal, a purpose. So that's, I think,
Absolutely. Yeah, that's incredibly important. I know here in the United States, we have, the NIH, we have the NCLBI, we have so many different funding organizations that then have kind of subgroups for different funding opportunities. So it's really important to look at the call for applications and make sure that you're able to tailor your application to whatever it is that they're asking for. I also want to just touch on what Dr. Martin said about making sure that you have a level of expertise. For a lot of us as graduate students, we're kind of developing our expertise, but it's really important that, you know, you're able to, if your lab is not particularly well-versed in a specific technique, maybe pull another PI onto your mentoring team who is an expert in that technique. And that can also go a really long way in A, showing that you have the initiative to find someone who has that expertise and can help you, but B, also strengthening your application by demonstrating to the review committee that you have the ability and the needs to be able to actually do whatever techniques it is that you're proposing. So thank you all for your answers to that question. We'll shift gears a little bit here, and let's say that you submit a funding application and it gets rejected. I'm sure we're all familiar with that here. What are your next steps after you find out that your application has been rejected?
I can start maybe. So I analyze, of course, the criticisms of the people who reviewed the grant and you know, see if I agree. Often I do. Often I think they have a point, and so try to revise your project, improve it according to those suggestions. Also, meanwhile, probably you also matured your idea a bit further. And also perhaps sometimes not necessarily change the project itself, but the way you're communicating, because something was not clear. So that's why they didn't understand it. A bit like in the papers, I guess. You try to, and try again. So basically we all fail, and then try. So I do this very often, try resubmit a revised version. I think this part of the funding agency is also important. Maybe your idea was not submitted to the right place, and so think, is there anywhere else where this would fit better? Or adapt the same idea. For instance, I work in mechanisms of disease, but if I'm applying to, and also in drug development for some diseases, but if I'm applying to a patient association, let's say, I try to do the more translational project, the thing that is more applied and that the patient association will see more the bottom, the end of it, and not so mechanistic research. Basically, it's the same. It can be actually the same project, but I'm explaining it probably in a way that is more suited to that agency. So that's another thing that I think you can do. You can often, what I do is also try to increase the preliminary data. Meanwhile, as you know, things go and come back, you're trying to build a bit more on that. And as you suggested before, to change the team, go recruit someone who has expertise and who can be in your team as co-PI, for instance, or as partner of the project, which would bring the required expertise.
Dr. Martin, Dr. Bafor, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think those are all excellent suggestions, and I agree with them all. For me, when one of my grants gets rejected, what I first do is I take a little bit of a break from the grant, because often you've put in a lot of effort and time and emotion, and often you feel angry and disappointed, and then it's not the best moment to actually read the comments because you might not interpret them as well as you should. So I normally sort of try and take a break, and as Matthew, one of the previous speakers, said so eloquently, life goes on. So don't let a rejected grant poison the rest of your life. You know, it's a grant, and sort of try and partition it to what it is. And then once your emotions have calmed down slightly, then you have a sort of more sober view to look at it. Then to me, the first thing that I do is I carefully read the feedback that I've gotten. If you have a trusted colleague or collaborator, you can also ask them to look through the feedback to get a view of, is it worth reapplying to this specific foundation, yes or no? Because sometimes the reviewers are just so negative that you think, well, it's just going to cost me a lot of extra time, and basically I'm going to have the same problems no matter what I do. If you're not sure, then I would suggest that you reach out to a grants manager, a program manager at the funding agency, and ask to speak to them specifically and say, look, are you interested in this topic? Does this fall within your scope? Is this the type of work you are interested in funding? And then if they say no, then you know to cut your losses and go elsewhere. If they say yes, but we want you to make all these changes, then at least you know that you stand a chance if you then make all those changes. And indeed, like was suggested, sometimes it's a matter of finding other collaborators, perhaps, that can add extra expertise that you didn't sort of add to the grant, making the aims a lot more specific. Perhaps you were too vague with your aims, perhaps cutting the grant down a little bit. Perhaps you're a bit too ambitious with what you were trying to do. Perhaps review your budget. Perhaps the budget wasn't quite right. And then sort of those are things that you can look at. I would suggest to perhaps find someone else that you closely work with to also take a look at your grant and get their feedback. Sometimes it can help to have a fresh pair of eyes, look at your writing or your grant, and that they say, well, to me, that doesn't seem very clear. Often when you're very sort of focused on your own work, to you it seems very clear, but to an outsider, to a reviewer that is not completely in that same topic, it might not seem clear. So it never hurts to sort of get an extra pair of eyes of someone that you trust, obviously, because obviously you have to be careful who you show your grants to. But if it's someone from your lab or a close collaborator, then you could ask them, what do you think of the text? Does it read clearly? And then if it is completely rejected, if you say there is no chance, then what you can do is find other maybe smaller private foundations, maybe change the scope of the grant slightly, or repackage the grant to make it a lot smaller, where you just focus on one aim and then submit it to another foundation. But I think the trick is to never give up, to keep trying.
Absolutely. Dr. Bafor, do you have anything to add before we move on to audience questions?
Yes. So first of all, Bronwen, you took the words right out of my mouth. So basically, that's what I do. I've learned through my many failures that when I get a grant, it's just a scanning I do the first day. When I get a response, a rejection to a grant, just scan through, because I'm always annoyed. I'm always frustrated, and that's okay. So if you are, that's fine. So I'm always, frustrated because, like you said, you've put in so much effort to it, and you just don't understand why So what I do, I'm just sharing what I do. So I just scan through the first day, and I usually my go-to is 2 days. I don't look at it for another 2 days or so. But at least a minimum of 2 days, sometimes even longer. I do other things, and then sometimes I go back, do another scan, leave it again 2 days, and you find that when you're looking at it with a more relaxed mind, sometimes you can see where the reviewers are coming from. You actually say, oh yeah, I agree with this. Okay, that's true. Looking back and forth. But at that first time, you're like, no, that's absolutely rubbish. This is wrong. The reviewers don't know what they're saying. I'm the best in what I do, and so on and so forth. So I do agree that everyone should take that time. 2 days, whatever works for you. Take a step back. Come back to it. Until you can look at it with a better perspective. And then for those grants that don't usually give feedback, make sure to ask for feedback. Find out why, your grant was rejected, and you'll be amazed. I do have an experience where I was rejected, and I was told, what I think I used the term, what went wrong, and the program manager said, no, your application was actually excellent, and you were actually among the top 3, but we had to choose just one, and it was a luck of the draw. So it does happen like that sometimes, and that makes you feel good to hear that. But then you ask yourself, why wasn't I that one that was picked, and things like that. But it happens, and then you go again. And I did apply again for one of them, and I got it. So it happens, that way. Once you need to also reach out. So like Bronwen said, get feedback from as many different people, and from the program manager especially, because that's the institute you're applying to. So hear from their perspective what they see, what they want, and things like that, if you can get perspectives from them, and then put it all together again. And if it's necessary, then yes, please get additional mentors, co-mentors that are relevant to the field of expertise that you may not have had, in order for them to look at it with from their perspective, to help get it better. So yeah, just my tips as well.
Absolutely. No, those are all fantastic answers and extremely insightful. I'll move on to the audience questions with our last couple minutes we have left here. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A section. Even after this panel's over, I think our panelists will be able to stick around and answer some of the questions over in the Q&A panel. So first question is from Samantha Room, who asks, how much of your time should be spent applying for funding? Is it a one-off process or is it continual?
I'm going to answer that. I'm hoping I understood the question right. But for me, it's a continuous process. It depends on what you're looking for, what you want. I mean, you can see when Matthew presented, he had applied for, different types of funding applications. So it depends on what you're looking for. And I usually tell people, in my own experience, applying for grants is somewhat addictive. For me, that's me. And that's because, you keep learning and you keep going high and high, and you keep wanting to know and things like that, and getting funds. And where I started from, I started from Nigeria. And just like Patricia said, research funding is quite poor there. And I had, no other choice but to look for, apply very a lot for grants. And I had to, it was a continuous process for me because I needed grants for different research projects that I was doing. And also to get over here, as well, I also needed to apply for grants. So I think, in my opinion, and also depends on what you're working on, what you want to achieve, what you want to get. It is a continuous process. But for some others, it may just be the one-off. So it all depends. It depends on the individual and what you want.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from Dr. Maciel or Dr. Martin before we move on to the next question?
No, I think for me it's also quite. I dedicate quite some time to grant writing, and I keep continuously.
Yeah. I think as a grad student, it's still a continuous process, but perhaps more punctuated than being a PI. Yeah. Obviously, as a grad student, we want to apply for our own funding, kind of pay our own way through. But with that being said, we're also still trying to get a degree and trying to complete projects for a thesis. So there are times, especially in my experience, where I've had to really kind of ramp down my research a little bit to write a grant. But as soon as I get it submitted, I'm back to mostly doing research. So I think it's a little bit different from the grad student point of view. But for PIs, it's probably a very continuous, seemingly never-ending process. The next question, excuse me, also from Samantha. Is there one central place where you can sign up for calls for applications? How do you know when funding is available? So how do you go about finding those calls for funding applications?
So at least my institution has some officers who look for the main funding agencies, let's say, that are relevant for us, but only for the main ones. I receive some information from those officers. I also, of course, sign up to the foundations that I already identified as relevant for me, and so basically mostly that's my sources. And then if I have a specific project for a specific topic, I have to go browsing and have to find additional ones. But it's
fantastic. I will say that Dr. Kaylee added a really good link to a website under the question itself in the Q&A tab if anyone wants to go and take a look at that. Dr. Bafor, Dr. Martin, do you have any other tips for looking for calls for applications?
I think, to me, the best place is to start within your university. Often within universities there are grants officers, and they know about most of the common grants that are specific for that certain country or region. And they will also know the deadlines and what you need to do to get those grants. For example, how much experience you need, etc. So I think the first thing would be to find these grants officers within your university, see if they're there or not, and if they are, sort of ask them, can you direct me towards a resource of common grants that people apply for here. Like Patricia mentioned, another great thing is, especially for smaller private foundations, is to sign up to their alerts. So they'll send you an email when a new grants call has been published. So then you get an email and then you know, okay, this might be interesting for me. A lot of universities actually have funding databases where you can actually, as a student or a postdoc or a PI, look up using keywords, for example, which grant funding is available for you. I know when I worked at the National Institutes of Health, we had access to some of the Johns Hopkins funding databases, which were actually very useful. And also the National Institutes of Health had its own NIH funding database, so you could actually look up to see which calls were coming and which ones were relevant to you. Here at the University of Antwerp in Belgium, we don't have that yet, but I'm trying to work together with a bunch of other people to set that up. So if your university doesn't have it, it's always worth going to talk to the research department, especially with a few senior researchers, and to say to the research department, we need this, because I think it saves you a lot of time, because often searching for funding can be time consuming. I see that as well as part of my job. It's quite a time consuming task. So the less time you can spend on searching for funding, better.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I think we're nearing the end of our time. So in the interest of everyone's time, I'll go ahead and thank our panelists for all the fantastic information that you've given us today. So thank you all for your time.